Okay, let's take a look at a section of the next module that sort of goes in two different directions, or I should have two parts to it. First part we want to look at in this discussion is this whole issue of theory. It's important to remember that there's parts of any modern discipline. There's basically two parts to it. One is theory, and the other is methods. Methods is the relatively straightforward part. It can be hard to do them, but methods is basically how you collect the information that you want to look at, whether it be data, whether it be measurements, whatever it is. That's the methods part. But the problem with methods is that it's basically descriptive. At some point, methods just tells you, gives you the results of what you wanted to ask, but it doesn't make sense of them. And you can see this, if you look at papers that are published, some papers are theoretical, and we're going to second other methodological. They talk about how you collect the information, what the results were. So it's like a report. This is what I saw. This is what I found. But the problem is it's not interpreting it. It's not saying, for example, why you should read it, or it's not saying what does it mean, what's the purpose or function, what's the result of this. That's the function of theory. So any modern discipline, and this is going on forever, basically has these two parts to it. There's how you collect the stuff, which is the methods. And then there's the theoretical component, which is basically your explanation of what you saw. And geography, because it looks at people and the world around us, tends to, as I mentioned, so far in a bunch of the videos, is very diffuse. It goes all over the place. What sort of holds geography together is theory and method, especially theories. Geographers, regardless of what aspect they're looking at, generally use a fairly limited number of theoretical approaches. Now, theoretical approaches sounds pretty intimidating, but all it is explanation. It's basically saying what your bias is. If, for example, you're an environmental determinist, we'll get to that in a second, it means basically that your bias is that you assume that the environment that people live in shapes their choices and their behaviors. That's what environmental determinism, and you think about it, sort of means that right off the bat. That's what it means. And if you say that that's what you are, when you come up with an explanation for stuff that you observed, people are going to know that you have that bias, that you think that that's why things happen. That's the function of theory. Theory provides not only a way for you to explain why you're interpreting stuff, but also, even more importantly, is a way for everyone else to understand what you think is important and what you're just sort of tossing out the window. And this is why when you read reports or analyses of something, you always want to look at usually it's in the introduction, or else even in the first chapter, they'll actually have some sort of discussion of the theoretical approach I used, why I use these, and if it's a good report, they'll actually say why they didn't use other approaches, why they don't think they worked. That's actually in some cases more important than the information, because if you think about it, if you want to look at the results, which might be in the last section, the results are entirely based on the first part, which is the theory. And if you don't agree with the theory, then it's almost a 100% chance you're not going to agree with the results. Or you're going to be skeptical that the results don't really reflect, what's actually going on out there, because the theoretical approach was screwed up. So theory is two things. Theory in a very straightforward way is just the way that people bias their assessments or how they analyze stuff. In academia, especially university, what you're going to find is theory becomes courses. Theory becomes almost like a life unto itself, because each discipline sort of defines itself by its theory, and then so that becomes like a closed shop and a secret handshake type thing. And it's like being part of the Masons or something like that. It's like if you're in the discipline, they have their theoretical approaches. The reality is there aren't really that many theoretical approaches, and almost none of them are disciplinarily or unique. But that's that's the academic thing to make himself special. The reality is theory is just a tool. It's basically an explanatory tool. But you always want to be aware when you're reading something, if you're thinking, oh, well, this guy seems to have something useful to say, you want to know what the theoretical approaches they're using, because that's going to skew how they look at things and how they interpret them. If you try to read something that doesn't have the theoretical approach, then run like hell. Because if they aren't going to put the theoretical approach in, it's because they don't want you to know. And that means that you've got to, quote, trust them, someone you don't know, a stranger, in terms of their analyses or what the results are, because they didn't bother to tell you what their biases were. And that usually means that there's some reason why they don't want you to know what that is. And then trust me, you don't want to waste your time reading it or listening to it, because you've got better things to do. So theory is hugely important, but theory, despite the fact that in academic classes, we don't do much in this class, but especially in advanced courses in your major, you'll find that the theoretical approaches become a big part of what you study, especially in grad school. But they're not, that's sort of like it's just something that they do in academia to make themselves special and to make you feel like you know something no one else does. Sorry. So let's take a look at some of these sort of basic concepts first, and we'll get into the specific theories we use in geography or have used in the past. First is qualitative versus quantitative. You see this a lot with the COVID stuff right now. Almost any other type of discussion going on falls around one of these two sort of parameters. And this is oftentimes seen as like a light switch, like you're either one or the other. In reality, it's more like a continuum, just like colors of a rainbow. Qualitative means that you look at the information from the standpoint of what does it give you. But it can be, for example, based on people's perceptions. It could be people's opinions. It could be based on the impressions that you have of something, what we call phenomenology. All of these would be qualitative approaches. The sort of opposite of that, or the counter to that, is what we call quantitative approaches, where you put numbers on stuff. Now, in some cases, this is a logical thing to do. If you're dealing with physical movement of something through space and time, you want to do it in terms of numbers, because how the hell would you do it any other way? If you're looking at chemical reactions, that's the way you do it. On the other hand, a lot of stuff, and this actually came up in a meeting we had last week, a lot of stuff that is oftentimes seen as quantitative really isn't. This is especially true in American society, because Americans have this enormous fascination with numbers. Not that they understand them, especially statistics, but they find numbers to be compelling. So if someone says this is a 30% better product than someone else, they'll go, oh, right, this is a better product and it's that much better. And they won't bother to ask, what 30% are you measuring? 30% of what? And who decided it was 30%? They'll just jump on the numbers and go, wow. So if you say something's better and you say something's 30% better, in the United States, people will invariably gravitate towards the 30% better, because that's got numbers attached to it. And at this point, we call this numerology in anthropology, which is just basically that you put numbers on things to make them magical and give them power. If you want to use in a Polynesian context, you give them mana. You give things mana by putting numbers on them. And like I said, we had this discussion last week in terms of, evaluating students' opinions on a class. If a class is 2.2 in terms of positivity and another class is 2.4, one, if it's only 5 opinions for 5 students, statistically, that's not a legitimate sample. And secondly, what the hell does 2.2 versus 2.4 mean? If it's different students, they probably have a different perception. If it's different classes on different subjects, they have a different perception. So can you really compare all that type of stuff? So all of that is actually qualitative. When you guys do student evals, those are qualitative. Now we get a report which actually has them put in statistically, which sort of in a very fake way makes them quantitative. But when you think about it, your opinion, this means all of you or any of you in the class, when you have an opinion on something, that's your opinion. And if you think about even the other folks in class, they might, they have different backgrounds, they have different perception, they're dealing with this online class differently. So, you guys aren't coming from a common standard point. So it's not really a measure in the sense of a number thing. It's a measure in the sense of your opinion on something. So opinion surveys are almost invariably qualitative. Now, if you're doing large groups of people surveying 100,000 people about something, then you can quantify the results. But again, they're summary results. So it's different than some sort of, sort of a hard and fast measure, like measuring the, speed of a comet or something like that. So qualitative versus quantitative. You find in Europe and in Asia, most of the research, or much more of it, tends to be qualitative, and that's considered equal. In the United States, qualitative research is not seen as legitimate as quantitative research. And so what you find is even geographers, for example, will quantify it. If you're working for the National Park Service and you're supposed to help them decide where to put a lookout so people can take pictures of the view, you'll actually find that their manual actually has quantified that, which is sort of dumb, because at some point it's actually a qualitative thing. Geographers know that, but the National Park Service wants numbers. So you numerologize the qualitative assessment. because that makes the folks that are going to give you the money more happy. So qualitative versus quantitative, most geographers and a lot of what we do is qualitative, but you'll oftentimes see it in a what I would call pseudo-quantitative form. And that's not necessarily because the geographer wants to do it that way. That's just because the way it's supposed to be done. So this is an Americanism, if you want to. It's an American idea of the value of numbers that does somehow more scientific than qualitative, which is erroneous. Culture concept. Culture concept, very straightforward. Culture and society are two related concepts. Culture is sort of a bigger concept. Society is a subset of that. Culture, the key thing for this class to remember, since it's a human or cultural anthropology geography course, is that culture is learned. You're not born part of a culture. You're born in a culture region, but you learn that as a kid. If you move to another culture, say, you're adopted, you move to France when you're 3, yeah, you might have been born in Hawaii, but the vast majority of what you learn when you grow up and by the time you're an adult, if that was all in France, you're going to be French. And because culture is learned. Culture is not programmed into you. We're not born speaking a language. We're not born with a set of attitudes and values. We acquire that by virtue of our surroundings and the people that are important to us and the things we listen to. So that's number one, because there's a huge problem with this in terms of people thinking that culture is somehow a genetic code. It's like your DNA or the color of your hair or your eyes or something like that. It's not. Culture has never been that, never will be that. Second is that culture is always group-based. One person is not a culture. One person might, they've got a personal opinion on something, but a culture is a collective. Culture is a collective set of attitudes and values that people have generated usually over time, and they bring up their kids or the other folks in the group in those, and they pretty much then manage or monitor or even control people's attitudes in the groups to make sure that they follow those. And this is what ostracism is. Ostracism is what you do to someone when they don't want to follow what the group wants. You throw them out or punish them somehow. So culture is group-based. Culture is a social phenomenon. Culture in many ways is one of the things that has made the human species so incredibly successful. Physiologically, we're not particularly impressive, but we're very, very effective in groups. And we're very effective in groups because our groups are very stable over time. This makes us actually different than a lot of our primate relatives. They have groups. I've studied Japanese macaques for a little while, and they're very sophisticated groups. And in many ways, they mirror exactly the same thing as human groups, but they're not as durable. And each generation, they change more. There's not the idea, you don't carry quite as much through from one generation to the next. Human cultures are incredibly durable. They're the way we've been most effective as a group organism, as a group species that has allowed us to dominate the planet. So culture is a huge part of makes us what we are. Culture is not only not programmed into you, but it's not based on color or anything else like that. Again, it's learned. In some societies, what color you are, what size you are, or for example, the shape of your nose, for example, if you're in some areas of Latin America, to a certain extent will define where you are in the group, but it's not race. Race is pretty much an American thing. Even European groups have very different attitudes of race. They have a concept of race, but it's not based, for example, on skin color. It might be based on physical appearance, it might be based on a bunch of stuff. Some of which is totally unintelligible to outsiders. So culture is not, again, attached to what you look like, your phenotype, and it's not something that you're born with, you acquire it. So that's the key thing to remember about culture. And do remember that, because that's how we use it in this discipline. And in fact, in all the related disciplines also. Society is a subset of that. Society is how geographers tend to look at culture, because society is a part of a culture in a particular location. So if you're talking about Chinese, there would be, you could talk about several groups. There would be the Chinese that they call diaspora, or overseas Chinese. It's Chinese here, Chinese in, say, New York, London, wherever it is. And then there would be the Chinese in China. Now, especially given the rapid political and social changes occurring in China, if you want to talk about Chinese as a group, by sort of the culture concept, you have to be pretty careful, because the Chinese living here, for example, in London, are undergoing a very different experience than Chinese in China, because that group is changing rapidly in different directions. So you want to define that in terms of some sort of physical parameters. So if you would, it's a regional or space definition, and that's society. When you're talking about Chinese society, you would be specifically talking about Chinese society in the People's Republic of China. If you wanted to talk about Taiwanese society, of course, they're Chinese also, that would be a different group. Now they're both part of the Chinese cultural system, but they function differently now to a certain extent, and they're in different political, social, dynamics. So society is a subset of culture, but it's basically place, or more accurately space-based. And so usually if geographers are looking at groups, we use the term society. Okay. As we'll see later, also ethnicity. Worldview. Worldview is pretty straightforward. Worldview is basically just the way that you view the world and everything in it. Worldview is always from the standpoint of an ego, i.e. an individual, because one of the basic premises of worldview is it's unique to every individual. Even brothers or sisters, for example, or maybe a year or two different in age, are going to have different worldviews. Why? Because they grew up in slightly different environments. The second one had an older brother or sister, et cetera, et cetera. So worldview is always from the standpoint of one person, but it then encompasses how they see everything, how they self-identify, the people that are important to them, the world around them, how they interpret that world. So worldview is just like it sounds, it's an all-encompassing concept, but the key for our part is that it's an individually driven phenomena. Geographers tend to look at this a lot when we look at like mental mapping, as I mentioned last time, because mental maps are going to be reflections of parts of worldview, or as we'll see, Second Life, that digital world also. Perception and reality. This is again, as much as these concepts are, they're actually really simple. They're very straightforward, and in most cases, you know exactly what the words mean already, but it's the application of them that gets them sort of tricky. One of the assumptions, again, that's pretty, I won't say unique to the United States, but stronger here, would be the idea that somehow reality exists. That reality is some sort of a fundamental property that you can actually be in, and therefore you can also not be in it. So, there's this idea of reality shows would be a perfect example. On one hand, they're supposed to be real, in the sense they're supposed to be real people interacting in real time, whatever. But in reality, they're all scripted, it's all set up, it's all pre-written. So they're actually just acted out shows. They're social plays. But they're called reality shows because this idea that reality is really fascinating to Americans. And we like to think we're grounded in reality. The reality, I'm sorry, bad pun there, is that we operate out of perception. How we see ourselves, how we see, again, worldview, how we see the world around us, how we see others, our perception in terms of what we choose to look at and what we choose not to look at or ignore defines how we interact with reality. Now, sure, there is reality here. I'm sitting in my office. Outside here is the hillside, and that's real. And if I go outside and it's raining, I'll get wet. That's real. But my perception of what is in this office and what's important about this office and why I'm in this office and all that type of stuff is based on my perception. And I can guarantee that whoever, whichever one is watching this, that your perception and my perception aren't the same. Again, perception is a uniquely individual thing, but it shapes reality because it shapes the choices we make. It shapes the things we pay attention to, and it shapes the things we ignore. So reality is driven by perception. And that's especially true of people, but it's also true of every other organism probably that exists. Last of these is logic. Logic is the process by which we come to it's a thinking process. It's the process by which you start with something and you get to some result. Geographers deal a lot with logic because a lot of what we do will be asking, especially in human geography, we'll be asking people stuff, well, what do you think about this? Or, why do you go shopping there? Why do you drink a Starbucks? And what do you want to hear is their answer. And in their answer, they're going to sort of, in many cases, almost justify why they do this versus that. That's their logic. Now, the key is what you'll find is invariably people see logic as grounded in reality. But from a functional standpoint, logic is actually, of course, grounded in perception. And logic is used as a justification or explanation for why you deal with things in a particular way. So threads of logic or paths of logic are something that geographers, for example, in some cases now, given it's more sophisticated, we can actually map those. And so, this is how we look at these type of concepts. Again, remember, they're really, really straightforward. It's how geographers specifically use them that makes them, sort of different. So do use how I've just talked about, and do use that during the semester. That's the way I want you to see these concepts.